called black metal music and encourages devil worship and the desecration of churches.
When I heard it, almost a cold shiver goes down your spine. What is all this about?
The ban, a form of music, they say, has disturbing satanic overtones.
Become almost absorbed in it.
Welcome to Blackfold, a black metal podcast. My name is Danny van Eyck. I've been fascinated by black metal for decades. Not so much by the music at first, but all the more by the tales behind it, the mythology, the villainous characters who inhabit both the music and the scene, the constant pushing of boundaries, whether they were musical, in the embrace of evil, or through the actual crimes, the arsons, kidnappings, torture, even murders. It never ceased to amaze me how many extreme things happened in such a relatively small scene. However, it never did much to warm me to the actual music. That was until September of 2021, when my family suffered a terrible loss. The mourning period following this, weirdly enough, I spent going down the black metal rabbit hole. I started listening to the classics. I read up on bands, spent hours, days, weeks, and then months digging ever deeper into a seemingly endless catalog of blast beats, tremolo picking, and maniacal screams. I enjoyed lo-fi recordings, and I was blown away by the more high-fidelity releases. I had found a project to take my mind off of the grief, and I was thankful to have this music become the lifeline that it turned out to be. And this podcast is my attempt at sharing my newfound fascination, and dare I say it, even love for this music. It is a scattershot approach at examining some of the pillars of the genre, delving into some of the key players of its past, its present, and its future, going over some of the themes of the music, and of course, diving into some of the more extreme things that define black metal's history. And although this history is indeed a defining feature of the genre, and an important element of this podcast, I also want to look at today's music, as well as the future of the scene. I don't want this to be a repeat of things people know about intimately already, but there are certain relatively well-known stories that deserve to be talked about all the same. Today, we will look not at one of those well-known stories, although it looms large in the background. No, we will look at its aftermath.
Hey, I watched when the World Trade Center came tumbling down. And I watched in Jersey City, New Jersey, where thousands and thousands of people were cheering as that building was coming down. Thousands of people were cheering. So something's going on. We gotta find out what it is.
Donald Trump's lies are so well established and so widely reported on that even his supporters have learned to take them for what they are. I don't think there's anything controversial about this statement. But this is the internet, and I'm sure one or two listeners will be hugely offended about me quoting his own words verbatim. They will probably also not enjoy the fact that I will now quote his follow-up when he was called out on his bullshit.
You know, the police say that didn't happen, and all those rumors have been on the internet for some time. So did you misspeak yesterday?
It did happen. I saw it. It was on television.
You saw that with your own eyes?
George, it
Police say it didn't happen.
There were people that were cheering in the other side of New Jersey where you have large Arab populations. They were cheering as the World Trade Center came down.
Just to be clear, none of this is true. Trump never saw this on TV. Simply because it never happened. He made it up whole cloth. And it's not the first time he did something like that. Nor will it be the last. Whether it's crowd sizes, border walls, tariffs being paid by other nations, or post-birth abortions, he will double and then triple down, often employing different lies that contradict his first ones. But he still feels that he is getting away with it. And in a way, he is. It is a professional wrestling of politics, and the audience has become a part of the kayfabe that comes along with it. They know the lies, They are just going along with it. But, of course, everybody knows politicians lie. Blowjobs are sexual acts. He was a crook, and the UK did have something to lose by leaving the EU. However, it is not just politicians who will employ misinformation to benefit themselves. There is an entire legion of grifters out there spouting nonsense and scare tactics trying to make a quick buck. There's Andrew Wakefield, Ben Shapiro, Charles Ponzi, Alex Jones, Russell Brand, and many, many more people have put themselves and their income, influence or status ahead of other people's well-being. When the visitors got off the plane at Fire Festival and found that nothing that had been sold to them was, in fact, on the island, when their luxury meal of 2 slices of bread, 2 cuts of cheese, some lettuce and a slice of tomato went viral, when the place slowly turned into Lord of the Flies, or when the main stage turned out to be such a safety hazard that even the bands that would have shown up, which of course they didn't, that they would have not even been able to play. Festival organizer and all-round horrible person Billy McFarland kept insisting that everything was fine. Of course, he had no plan B. Hell, he had not even really had a plan A. But the message remained, relax guys, it's going to be great. All pathological or chronic liars share one defining characteristic. Their fabrications are presented in a way that portrays the liar favorably. The liar decorates their own person by telling stories that present them as the hero or the victim. Our subject of today presents himself as both, often at the same time. Of the 23 stab wounds that ended Øystein Arsen's life, a large number, maybe even the majority, were inflicted by a pane of glass which he had fallen through. The final stab, the one to his skull, was so hard that it was almost impossible to get the knife out afterwards. And both of these are statements about the knife attack on Mayhem guitar player Euronymous. Both statements were made by the perpetrator, Varg Vikernes. Depending on what reaction he is looking to elicit, he will use either one, and he has done so on multiple occasions. When he wants to downplay the events of that night, he will use the first, along with an entire spiel about why he went up to the guitarist's house at 3 a.m. in the first place, how the victim went for a knife first, and how, even if he hadn't reached for that weapon, he could still claim self-defense. But if he wants to look tough, he will sell you the second. I guess that most everybody listening to this podcast, and almost anybody with even a slight interest in black metal, or even metal music in general, has heard about this night a lot. And don't worry, I won't rehash things. You know what happened. Instead, I want to look at what happened after this one particular night. How did the years following this gruesome murder play out, and how did they shape or maybe even reshape the young man who carried out the attack? This episode will deal with the 15 years after his sentencing. His transformation from murderous black metal musician to Nazi ambient producer, and, as we come to find, a hell of a lot more. However, even if we know a lot of what happened before already, it won't hurt too much to go back in time just a little bit first and clue in those select few of you who have no idea what we are talking about. Varg Vikernes, or Christian Vikernes, or Count Grishnek, or Grijfi Grishnek, or the Count, or Greven, or Gandalf the White, or Louis Cachet, or Varg Quisling Larsson Vikernes, was born in the Fana district of Bergen, Norway in 1973. He claims that age 6 he moved with his family to Iraq, where his father worked for Saddam Hussein as a developer of software. Young Christian is eager to tell us that he was enrolled in a local elementary school. He additionally claims that this was where many of his ideas pertaining to racial identity took hold. But besides him telling this story in an interview for the book Lords of Chaos, I was unable to verify the veracity of any of his claims. And, as we will come to find, and as I alluded to already, the problem with pathological liars is that they will make up stories to be more interesting to others. And they often even end up believing them, or something very close to it themselves. His mother did back up at least some of his claims, but as we will come to find, I don't believe she is really worth a huge benefit of the doubt either. What we do know for certain is that young Christian started listening to metal music when he was 12. Coincidentally, at that same time, his father left his family. Iron Maiden was his gateway drug of choice, but he soon ventured onto heavier bands like Sodom, Pestilence, Celtic Frost. At age 14, he started playing guitar himself, and at 17, he had a short stint as the guitarist of black death metal band Old Funeral, where he even played together with Abbott of later Immortal fame for a shorter period of time. But his true musical breakthrough came with his one-man project Burzum, with which he recorded a number of genre classics. Most notable among them, Vislice Taros and Philosophum, which were both recorded pre-incarceration, but they were released only after his myth-making was complete, and thus bringing the most attention to their 1994 and 1996 releases respectively. Burzum's influence on the black metal scene cannot be overstated. The man made some insanely good records, and his combination of atmosphere, anger, metal, and ambient soundscapes were not only highly original, they were also of another world in terms of songwriting and influence. Listening to those albums today shows you how they changed and influenced the black metal music still 30 years later. And it's not weird for any band to list Burzum as a huge inspiration on their music, even though the man behind it is such a divisive figure. The music is just that good. And now that we have his music out of the way, we can delve into the actual meat and potatoes of this episode. When it comes to the reason why Vikernes was imprisoned, I'm sure most of my listeners will know the story. So in keeping with my earlier promise, I will keep this brief. Varg, now his legal name after officially rejecting his Christian name, Christian, was sentenced in May of 1994 on the following counts. Count 1, the murder of Oystein Aarseth, also known as Euronymous. Count 2, the arson of 3 churches. Count 3, the attempted arson of a 4th church. Count 4, the theft and storage of 150 kilograms of explosives. The total verdict came to 21 years imprisonment. Up to this day, he maintains that the first charge should have been self-defense or manslaughter at most. Although, having driven from Bergen to Oslo with co-defendant Snorre Rug, with the obvious and outspoken intent of carrying out the murder. Going so far as to have a third person go to his apartment, rent movies, and take out money in his absence with the sole purpose of supplying him with an alibi. The second and third charge he claims to be innocent of, even though he took credit for the arsons in his marketing as well as in an interview with a local newspaper, in which he shared details only known to the police and the perpetrator. The fourth he claimed to be guilty of. It was also the one charge he couldn't lie about, so, still surprisingly, he didn't. Well, in a way, he didn't. As with all fantastical liars, he was able to argue that his actual intent with the explosive was misunderstood. Of course. According to Vikernes, he only intended to blow up what he calls some Antifa building in Oslo. It is generally believed that he was talking about the Blitz House, a self-managed social center, vegan cafe and feminist radio station that can still be found on Pilestredet in Norway's capital. He was not, however, planning to blow up Nidarosdomen Cathedral in Trondheim, as was taken up in his sentencing. Not sure why that would be the thing to be a stickler about, though. My interest in doing this episode so early on in this podcast run came to me when I read a short Instagram story that I've been unable to verify, but that at least sounds so in character and likely that I believe it to be absolutely true. And since Vikernes has made it close to impossible to know what is and isn't reality when it comes to his goings-on, I have decided to share it with you regardless. Because although only a few lines long, the message reads so much like the Varg of today that I could not help but laugh my ass off at something that, had it happened to almost anyone else, would have actually been quite tragic. It reads as follows. September 11, Besançon, France. A locally known musician and controversial figure Varg Vikernes reportedly experienced a severe psychological breakdown following a weekend of live-action role-playing as a German soldier during a localized World War II reenactment event. Witnesses at the event in the remote French forest described a dramatic scene as Vikernes, 51, became increasingly absorbed in his role. Friends and fellow participants stated that while Vikernes appeared to initially enjoy the immersive experience, it quickly escalated into a troubling episode of paranoia and confusion. I thought he was just really into it at first. It's LARPing, people get into their character, said one attendee. But then he started acting erratically, like there was a real war happening. It was alarming. Around 3:32 p.m. his behavior escalated. Vikernes was seen wandering through the forest, distressed and shouting incoherently. Campers described hearing him mutter about sacrifices and a sense of duty, which, they feared, would lead to a dangerous situation. Witnesses described him as increasingly agitated, before he suddenly brandished a weapon and fired several shots into the air. Authorities were quickly alerted, and law enforcement was able to respond to the scene within minutes. Again, I was not able to confirm this actually happened, but boy does it sound like the Varg we all know. And whether it's true or not, it did make me wonder about what had happened after that boy flashed his mischievous smile upon hearing his sentence, read by a Norwegian judge, locking him away for the next decade and a half. And apparently the man himself wanted us to know as well. As it turned out, he wrote a short book about it that happened to have been released only a month before I started my investigation into Norway's prison system and Vikernes' time within it. It is called To Hell and Back Again Part 3, My Prison Story. I've read it, so you don't have to. The year must have been 1997. I was walking the streets of Oslo with my then girlfriend on our way to what was to become our apartment on Islandsgata when we passed a large mustard-colored building. It was surrounded by 8-meter-high concrete walls. There were cameras, and I kid you not, it was flanked by a children's playground. As we were passing, a bell rang, and the large green doors to the side opened, and people poured out. I told my girlfriend that I at first had thought that we were passing a prison instead of this factory, and she looked at me with that mixture of surprise and pity that would soon become an indicator that I was, in fact, not going to move to Oslo, and she told me, "It is a prison, but they're going home. It's the weekend." And she continued on her way, leaving me startled and hurrying through a crowd of inmates to catch up with her. As my last name might have made clear, I live in the Netherlands, a free and safe society with a relatively mild penal system. In fact, our prisons were at one point so underpopulated that we rented out cells to house prisoners from Belgium and, funnily enough, Norway for a while. However, our system, a system focused on reducing recidivism, is in no way as highly regarded as the Norwegian system. One needs only Google best prison system in the world to see how the Norwegian way is heralded as being the best and most functional system there is. And with a reconviction rate of 20% after 2 years, they seem to do the job. It is the ultimate proof that harsher penalties do not lead to a better society, and that punishment as a means unto itself in fact makes for an unsafe future of a population. If you were to believe Vikernes, though, it is hell. It was only 2 years before that late Friday afternoon when I walked shoulder to shoulder with those prisoners on leave that he had left those same gates of Oslo Fengsel, handcuffed in a cage in the back of a van, for Bergen Fengsel, where he was to sit out his sentence. I imagine him driving past Schweigardsgate, number 56, where once Helvete record shop was located. I mean, it's literally directly adjacent to the jail. I imagine him seeing it, seeing the now empty windows, and feeling regret for what he had done. If he did, he never let anyone know. He also wouldn't tell by reading his 150-page attempt at a book. Hi, Danny here. Just a quick thank you for listening to our podcast. We are happy to know that people are listening to the content we've created, and we truly hope that you are enjoying it. Making an hour-long weekly podcast is a pretty time-consuming side job, but it is one we love to do. However, that is something that I myself pretty much took for granted when listening to other podcasts. Hours upon hours of research go into writing one of these episodes. And our editor and producer then spend a lot of time checking my stories and then making them somewhat listenable for you. So what do we ask in return? Nothing. This show is free, and it will remain free forever. We believe in putting out a quality product that is enjoyable for almost everyone. However, we did set up a Patreon for the show, and if you can afford it, then we would welcome your patronage. But only if you can afford it. We have not planned anything specifically for patrons, and we are not eager to do so, as we do not believe in making our content exclusive to people who are able to pay for it. But we do welcome any donations you wish to make. So, you can head on over to patreon.com/Blackfold podcast and leave us a small tip if you want to. We would also appreciate it if you could give us a 5-star review anywhere you can. And now, back to the podcast. In all honesty, even if it is put forward as a single novel, this book is part of a larger series about Varg's life, which is being released in small installments. His prison story is part 3, and as I was not going to put myself through the ordeal of struggling through the prose, the spelling errors, the lies and myth-making of his other booklets, if they were not a part of the story I'm telling here today. It is the only one I have read. Online. For free. Sorry, not sorry. Being imprisoned is terrible. It is unnatural, and instinctively people will long for a life outside of the confines of their institutionalization. In fact, it is so inherently opposite to a human being's nature that in a number of countries, including my own, escaping from prison is not even considered a crime in and of itself. This is not the case in Norway, however. And as lauded as Norway's prison system is, and how low the reconviction of its prisoners remains, their prisons are still confinement. In fact, Norwegian prisons have received major backlash and international critique from their local ombudsman as well as their EU Committee Against Torture on the inappropriately long times that prisoners spend in solitary confinement. The latter even wrote a report in 2019 in which they expressed great concern about the extent of prolonged solitary confinement and that the conditions for use of this solitary confinement were often not sufficiently clear. Something that was seconded by the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture. This solitary confinement, as it was at the time of that report, as well as during the time our story takes place, has led to a lot of professionals warning that such practices could lead to creating and exacerbating mental health issues among inmates. And unfortunately, the relatively high number of suicides among prisoners show that these warnings are to be taken seriously. As a comparison, in a study undertaken between 2011 and 2014, it was found that in Norway, 180 out of 100,000 prisoners took their own lives, as opposed to 67 out of 100,000 in the way stricter US prison system. Of course, these numbers are very skewed, as the total capacity of Norwegian prisons is a mere 3,700, and it makes sense to account for the fact that such drastic measures tend to be undertaken by those with the harshest sentences. Still, 26 people ending their life in prison over a 4-year period is nothing to scoff at. But sure enough, no matter how good your prison system is, no matter how low your recidivism, and no matter how well you prepare your inmates for a return to society, being locked up remains an unnatural state of existence. It is a strain on your mental health, and it skews your social interactions. Basically, it is one of the worst experiences a human being can be made to undergo. So, this episode, I am trying to walk a tightrope in going over the incarceration of Varg Vikernes, dispelling some of his weirder claims, making fun of the grandiosity of some of his others, while trying to be respectful of the prison experience of both him and inmates like him. If I fail, I apologize. Of course, even in a rich and prosperous nation such as Norway, there is still a lower class. Socially and economically, there is a group of people up north that are not as well-to-do as the majority is. Norway knows a 74% employment rate, as compared to the average of 67% in other OECD countries, and 0.5% poverty rate, which is also way lower than that of other countries. The USA, for instance, has a poverty rate of 11.5%. However, there is still about 10% of Norwegians who live in what we call low-income households, and this number has grown over the last decades. As is the case in almost every European country, it is often the immigrant families who bear the brunt of this poverty. A lot of Middle Eastern and African people who were brought in to take care of the labor the average Norwegian was and remains unwilling to perform are now among the largest risk groups in social and economic matters. Mind you, those numbers were still way lower when Varg walked into his cell block in Oslo for the first time, but he still makes a point of telling us about his observations. In fact, he goes so far as to inform us that
no, a huge percentage, perhaps even a majority, even in 1993, of prisoners in Norway were not Norwegians by blood.
For anyone wondering about Varg's abilities as a writer, that one short quote contains one period, 4 commas, 2 of which are in the wrong place, 4 words in italics for some unspecified reason, and 2 exclamation points, one of which between brackets. It's not great. Now, it should be absolutely obvious that a Nazi will write Nazi stuff in a book about his experiences. However, as a reader, it is still quite a shock to the system to see Vikernes casually address his racial ideas and his identity politics in the way he does. He is flippant or downright antagonistic when discussing Muslims, discusses inmates preferring sex with donkeys over women, talks about politicians in parliament by highlighting their Jewish heritage, repeats over and over again that the journalist whom he confided his crimes to was Christian, but then he goes out of his way, for some reason, censoring the N-word by replacing the G's with asterisks. Anyway, he continues,
I know, because I was there, and I saw it with my own eyes.
So basically, trust me, bro. But the man's ire is not contained to his fellow prisoners. His grievances are with the system. The guards, the psychologists, the wardens, and most everybody else he interacts with, save for those few who help him by protecting him from his perceived enemies, those who adhere to the same racist ideologies, and those whom he looks to help him navigate the prison system from the inside out. Mostly what he calls bodybuilders for some reason. He speaks in friendly tones about the skinheads he played table tennis with, but he makes sure to inform us that even those interactions involve them screaming racial slurs out of a window to fellow prisoners, of course. His ambition of being the toughest guy in Norway while also being the sorriest victim in the country means that we read boasts about him wanting to fight 7 other inmates at once and them not daring to do so, as well as Varg crying foul about not receiving any mail whatsoever and being further isolated from the world outside. The reasoning behind this lack of correspondence, according to the man himself, is that all letters addressed to him were wrongly considered Nazi or Satanist propaganda, and as such they were not forwarded to Vikernes. Whether this is true or not is unclear to me. However, seeing how the racist organization, the Heathen Front, which he claims not to have founded, but all signs point to him doing just that, had his prison P.O. box as its main listed address, I do think that a lot of the correspondence would have been of highly dubious nature. How inconvenient for the man waiting for letters from his mother and daughter, whom, come to think of it, I don't recall being mentioned in the book once. Not writing letters didn't mean he didn't write at all, as Varg wrote an influential, in all the wrong circles, manifesto about a return to pre-Christian beliefs. Vargsmal, or Varg's speech, is the 37-page ramblings of a racist, misanthropic wannabe philosopher that somehow led to the earlier mentioned Heathen Front basing their entire outlook upon it. Of course, no one loves the things Varg spoons as much as Varg himself, so it's not a stretch to believe he would be behind the organization at large, if we can call it an organization at all. Over the years of his imprisonment, Vikernes moved between prisons often. Something that is not at all standard practice in Norway. But I guess if you're dealing with a murderous, fascistic, semi-famous narcissist, then the standard is not appropriate anyway. Obviously, over longer sentences, a few moves are reasonable. However, the amount of transfers he did indicates something else altogether. After his time in Oslo's prison, Varg did time in Bergen, Ila, Tonsberg, Ringerike, Trondheim, and Tromsø. In some, he even did multiple stints, relocating back to prisons he was moved away from before. He goes into detail about his strife with guards and personnel, his dislike of the system, and insinuating that a prison psychologist somehow was to blame for a superfluous number of suicides in Bergen prison. However, he does have some friendlier words for the few who held the same National Socialist beliefs he himself does, praising those whom possessed Nazi memorabilia and who let him take out old National Socialist literature. Mostly, he just hates everybody. Guards, wardens, psychologists, social workers, other prisoners, everyone, basically. The funniest thing, however, if you are a fan of irony that is him telling his readers that he was happy to have his books in solitary confinement, so that he did not have to hang out with criminals. Another irony is that the prison drama he wrote down hardly makes mention of the work he did while incarcerated. Probably because it doesn't quite line up with the Shawshank vision of the prison experience that he wants to portray. Obviously, his music went in a completely different direction while locked up, having only a synthesizer to work with. But he was still able to record 2 full albums behind bars. Both terrible, by the way. And on top of that, he wrote a fair number of books/pamphlets/manifestos. Of course, having access to books, a synthesizer, recording equipment, a private cell, etc. are all things that were available because of the prison system being what it is. However, writing a book about your prison life means having to let those finer things sieve out so that the coarser elements can truly shine. Norwegian prisoners, in all but the most extreme cases, get to spend time outside the prison walls after just 4 years on the inside. Varg's first came after 10. For some reason, he writes. That reason, of course, could be that there had been a foiled 1997 plan to break him out of prison by 5 neo-Nazis. Among them was Tom Eitenes, whom Vikernes had befriended in prison and who himself escaped incarceration while on leave. That group had stockpiled guns, explosives, bulletproof vests, steel helmets and balaclavas and basically thought of themselves as an Einsatzgruppe, an SS death squad responsible for mass murder. Besides their plans to spring Varg from prison, they were plotting political and religious terror in Norway. Varg's mother, Lene Bohr, had even provided them with 100,000 Norwegian crowns, around 16,000 euros in today's money. Even though she supplied them with the equivalent of a medium family car or a down payment on a house, she apparently didn't really know who she was giving that money to, as she maintained that she had no idea the group consisted of right-wing extremists and only paid the money because her son had been attacked in prison. Supposedly another inmate had broken his jaw in a fight, but the warden of said prison vehemently denies this ever happened. You see now why I don't really count her as a reliable source? So, the first time Varg was allowed to go on leave was 2003. Coincidentally, the same year he tried to escape. Funny how that worked out. And the story of his escape is one that is filled with mystery, intrigue, hidden weapon caches, carjackings at gunpoint, and Varg driving a car into a police blockade, while at the same time being the most pedestrian, boring prison break ever. There's no real life imitating art here, just real life. And real life is seldom as exciting as the art we consume. At midnight, on October the 25th, Vikernes failed to return to prison after having spent a number of days outside its walls. According to the man himself, he had stayed in Oslo, and he had conspired with a number of unnamed others to escape Norway altogether. He also tells us he is going to keep stum about a number of things, not to harm those who helped him. Mind you, he writes this mere lines after claiming that he was all alone in the world and that he had no contacts left whatsoever. Make of that what you will. Instead of going to his low-security prison, an old converted concentration camp, according to Vikernes, he took off in the car of another convict whom he had befriended and headed off for a cabin in the mountains. And here it becomes even more difficult to separate fact from fiction, or rather, reality from paranoia. Upon reaching his hideaway, the new escapee meets the occupant of one of the other cabins, a local man hunting birds with his dog and a shotgun. Now, I am unaware of the level of fame Vikernes still carried at the time, almost 12 years after his conviction, but he claims to have become very afraid the man had recognized him, and he decides to drive all the way around the mountain and walk back up to the cabin from the opposite side. Within hours, he is startled by barking dogs, even though, having met the hunter's canine earlier, and seeing an SUV with an emblem on its side parked in a weird manner on the road leading up to the cabins. Varg, based on what I can only assume is general self-aggrandizement, paranoia, and the stress of being on the run, decides that the cabin is compromised. Not only did the hunter recognize him, but the dogs he hears are absolutely not the same breed as the dogs he saw. The car blocking the road and the occupants of the other cabins must be from a special governmental unit looking to murder him. Why, you might ask? Because Norway has a Jewish minister of justice who might have tricked him into escaping and conspired with Varg's own, sometimes existing, sometimes not, friends to have him do so. It all makes sense. He needed to leave, and he needed to leave now. If they were really planning to kill him, then he would need witnesses. So he ran from the cabin, through a marsh, and to the place where he had left his friends, or the co-conspirator of the Minister of Justice, depending on whatever Varg believed at the time, car, and sped down the mountain. A salient detail is that in his telling of the story, he sometimes claims to have seen men in ski masks carrying SMGs and assault rifles while fleeing. In his book, he only maintains to having said this, which means, well, I have no idea what it actually means. What I do know is that in fleeing from the cabin, Varg left behind a G3 battle rifle and took an MP5 SMG with him in the car. Coincidentally, the exact weapons he claims the men near his cabin were carrying. Yet, he maintains that these were only parts of the weaponry. Because obviously that is what you take with you during an escape from prison, 2 partially completed rifles. Another thing I know without a doubt is that the icy roads were too much for Vikernes' late-night paranoia and adrenaline-fueled descent, as it wasn't long before he lost complete control of the vehicle and crashed it into a boulder, completely wrecking it in the process. In his mind's eye, he could already see the dogs sniffing out their way towards him, while the special forces came rushing down the mountain in order to do the evil politician's bidding. So, it was a huge relief when a Volvo came down the mountain instead. Its occupants were less lucky, however, as Varg stopped the car in its descent and told the couple and their teenage daughter to get out. And when the driver asked him why, he showed him a pistol and told him, "Because of this." Now that sounds like a cool line from a movie, right? Unfortunately, Vikernes ruins the only cool thing he supposedly did that night by claiming he showed the family a flashlight, pretending it was a gun. Come on, Varg. It was a gun. You know you want it to be cool. Isn't that why you refer to it as a gun only a little bit later anyway? The best Varg can think of is to hightail it back to Oslo, where at least there are other people who will witness him going down in a hail of bullets should that happen. Of course, the reality, again, is so much sillier. In fact, it's even sillier than the circumstances should have ever allowed for. Because within minutes of him driving off from the carjacking, the police are aware of this. Because, although Varg made sure the family surrounded their cell phones, the father had told him he didn't have one. Of course, Varg knew he had one. He just didn't press the man on it. The man whose car he was stealing at gunpoint. But hey, he knew. Yeah, he knew. And So, as soon as he pulled into the Oslo metropolitan area, Vikernes was spotted by the first police vehicle he came across and subsequently was slowly and easily led into a roadblock, thus ending the least exciting police chase to cap off the least exciting escape attempt I've ever heard of. But of course, there was the story of the man driving into a police car at the roadblock to finish it all off. And what a story it is. You see, the Volvo Varg had stolen was an automatic and not a standard European stick shift. So once his car had come to a complete stop at the police barrier and they had him at gunpoint, Varg sat with his hands in the air and was told not to move. A cop pulled his door open and Vikernes made it a point of telling her that the car was still in drive. A second officer told him not to worry about it, but as the first cop dragged him out of the driver's seat, the car indeed started to move. According to an amused Vikernes, the cop who pulled him out almost fell. Did you hear that? She almost fell. Hilarious. The car then rolled on for a little bit and bumped into the fender of the police car in front of it before coming to a complete stop. What a rush. And so, a mere 19 hours after it had started, came an end to the worst jailbreak of all time. One where even when the jailbreaker himself tells a story, you can do nothing more than shrug and, at times, roll your eyes. Or, in my case, snicker a little bit. A jailbreak foiled by paranoia and narcissism on the part of the guy trying to get away. Quite a fitting end to this chapter. Or at least, it would have been a fitting end, but let us not forget, there are still the tiny matters of the machine gun, the assault rifle, the carjacking, the pistol, and a fabled missing hand grenade. So, the actual chapter came to an end when an additional 18 months was added to an already lengthy prison sentence, and Varg was sent back to a maximum security facility in Tultime. The police reported that in the car they found the following items: a number of knives, a gas mask, camouflage clothing, a portable GPS navigator, maps, a compass, a laptop, and a mobile phone. And back at the cabin in Rolag, they additionally found a handgun, the G3 automatic rifle, or as Varg maintains, parts of one. And from their investigation, the police quickly realized that Vikernes had indeed had help from outside. But as we today know, it is unknown from whom this help came. What we do know is that Varg himself didn't describe them as friends, and at one time thought they were in cahoots with his enemies. The final stretch of his incarceration was, by all accounts, relatively smooth sailing. Vikernes describes the modern facilities at the new Ringerike prison as a hotel prison, and takes great pride in refusing to perform assembly labor in their work program, where inmates learn trades. He openly mocks the prison for taking away his allowance and then providing it back to him after 2 weeks, and calls the system weak and pathetic. The irony of him being unwilling to put one foot in front of the other while calling the system weak and then feeling sorry for himself for being isolated is completely lost on him. Again. Of course, Varg being Varg, he then, mere paragraphs later, informs us that he preferred isolation over being among criminals and immigrants. By now you get the picture, I suppose. The rest of his book is spent complaining about showers. In prison. A lack of books to his liking. In prison. I guess Nazi literature is scarce in Norwegian jails. The quality of TV programs. In prison. How Eastern Europeans are more relatable to him than Norwegian prisons. I guess certain immigrants are fine then. The Somalian educational system. Don't ask. The wasting of resources on reintegration, the leniency of Trondheim prison, communists, the Freemason royal family, and on and on. But I think you get the point. Vikernes is sorry for himself and a hero all at once. He is the victim and the rebel. He is the sorriest man alive, and yet somehow so cool as well. His signing off is hilariously in keeping with the rest of the book, and I will let the man tell it himself. Mind you, this was written 30 years after killing a young man by stabbing him over 30 times, mostly in the back, setting fire to historical buildings, and planning terroristic attacks.
Too many. I'm a villain. To others, I am not. That is fine. I do not care. To me, I did nothing wrong, and the injustice I faced was to be expected. The adversity I faced might have been unjust and even illegal, but today I'm fine with all that. It helped me into what I am today. It helped me grow, learn, and become better. It helped me become what I am today. In order to reach the zenith, you have to walk uphill after all. Gelobt sei, was hart macht.
Yes, he actually wrote that. To anyone who knows about Vikernes today, about him being an actual immigrant in a foreign land, about him actively lip-syncing in videos on TikTok, about his arrests in his adopted home country of France, about him being one of the prized recipients of the manifest written by mass murderer and right-wing terrorist Anders Breivik, about his weird karate reels. Nothing we discuss should come as a surprise. The man is a serial narcissist. A serial narcissist who went to prison and came out a broken man. But a narcissist, all the same. He is a has-been in music, a has-been in culture, a failure in leading his rebellion, a walking contradiction, a forgotten man who once had the ear of the scene and is now the laughingstock of the same. A man who made 2 amazing albums and one alright one. A man who now shits all over the only actual good music he once made. It would have been funny had it not been so sad. Yet to me, the funniest part is that he is so self-involved that there is a huge chance he is actually listening to this podcast himself right now. And not because of what we do here, mind you, but the guy has become such an insecure actor that anything, even pertaining to him in the smallest part, he instantly consumes and reacts to. Desperately searching for every tiny bit of validation, knowing deep down that he himself is full of shit. And if you're listening, Christian, save it. I don't care. To all others, thank you for listening to Blackfold, and join us for episode 5 next week. Okay, the liner notes. Well, it happened. It actually happened. One of the books I used to write this episode was Lords of Chaos by Dietrich Söderlind and Michael Moonihan. Their interview with Varg Vikernes was insightful, although they should have been more combative. However, Varg hates the book, so that speaks well for them. When it comes to the Norwegian prison system, I found a lot of good information through the non-profit First Step Alliance. I also perused the governmental website Criminal Omsorgen, and I spoke at length with a player within the justice system, as well as 2 currently imprisoned individuals in Bergen and Oslo on the basis of anonymity. Prison Insider shares a good overview of the prison system, as well as highlighting some issues with solitary confinement and suicide rates. These issues are further highlighted in the UN Committee Against Torture annual report in 2018, which includes the findings of the Norwegian Ombudsman. Of course, a large part of this episode was based on Varg's own writing on the subject in the abysmal leaflet To Hell and Back Again, Part 3, My Prison Story. And I had to combine my reading of the work and do a lot of internet sleuthing trying to separate the facts from fiction. I have not read Part 1, Part 2, and Part 4 of this series, and honestly I'm not sure why anyone in their right mind would voluntarily do that to themselves. We have used the snippets of music in this episode on a fair use basis, and have included them as a way of explaining the music that fueled the story, and we have no financial incentive in sharing the snippets as such. Our theme music is performed by Spectral Wound and is used with their permission. If you would like to hear more from them, look for the only band called Spectral Wound wherever you get your music, or visit their Bandcamp page and buy some of their amazing merchandise. This podcast was written and recorded by me, Danny van Eyck. Audio engineering and production by Mick Schouten. And technical assistance, editing and encouraging words came from Björn Bolderdijk. We are on Instagram as Blackfold Podcast, all one word. So give us a follow and share your feedback in the comments if you want to. Join us for episode 5 next week.